Jake Thornton had been riding alone through the New Mexico desert for 3 days when he made the mistake that would change his life forever. He had been tracking a group of cattle rustlers who had stolen a dozen head from his ranch, following their trail deeper into territory he knew was claimed by the Apache. His neighbors had warned him not to go alone, but Jake was stubborn. At 35, he had spent the last 10 years building his ranch from nothing, and he was not about to let thieves take what he had worked so hard for. The sun was high and merciless when Jake stopped to water his horse at a small creek. He was examining the tracks on the muddy bank, so focused on his task that he did not hear them approach until it was too late. One moment he was alone, and the next he was surrounded by Apache warriors. But as his hand moved instinctively toward his gun, he realized something that made him freeze. These were not warriors. They were women. At least a dozen of them, all armed with bows and rifles, all watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility. The woman who appeared to be their leader stepped forward. She was perhaps 40, with streaks of gray in her long black hair and eyes that seemed to see right through him. She spoke in Apache, and when Jake shook his head to indicate he did not understand, she switched to heavily accented English. "You are on our land," she said. "You follow tracks that lead here." "Why?" Jake raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no threat. "Rustlers stole my cattle," he said. "I was tracking them. I did not mean to trespass. I will leave." The woman studied him for a long moment, then spoke rapidly to the others in Apache. There was a brief discussion, with several of the women gesturing animatedly. Finally, the leader turned back to Jake. "We know these rustlers. They are bad men who steal from everyone, Apache and white alike. They passed through 2 days ago. We sent them running." She paused, then added, "You will come with us." It was not a request. Before Jake could protest, several of the women had surrounded him, taking his weapons and his horse's reins. They bound his hands in front of him with rope, not cruelly but firmly, and began leading him deeper into the canyon. As they walked, Jake tried to make sense of what was happening. He had heard stories of Apache war parties, of raids and conflicts, but he had never heard of a group composed entirely of women. The women around him ranged in age from teenagers to grandmothers, all moving with the confidence of seasoned warriors. They spoke amongst themselves in their own language, occasionally glancing at him with expressions he could not quite read. After several hours of walking, they arrived at a hidden canyon where a small village had been established. There were perhaps 24 dwellings, and as they entered, more women and children emerged to see the captive. Jake noticed immediately what was missing. There were no adult men, only women, children, and a few elderly men who watched from the shadows. The leader took Jake to the center of the village, where she tied him to a sturdy wooden post that had clearly been used for this purpose before. Then she stood before him and began to speak, and this time another woman translated her words into clearer English. "I am Nalin. I lead these women. We are what is left of 3 different bands, driven from our lands by soldiers and settlers. Our men were killed or taken prisoner. We have chosen to stay together, to protect ourselves and our children. We do not trust white men. You understand this, yes?" Jake nodded slowly. "I understand. And I am sorry for what has been done to your people. But I am just one man trying to protect what is mine. I did not come here to cause trouble." Nalin studied him. "We will see what kind of man you are. You will stay with us for now. If you prove to be honorable, perhaps you will leave. If not," she shrugged, leaving the alternative unspoken. Over the next several days, Jake remained tied to the post, though the bonds were loosened enough that he could sit and move his arms somewhat. The women of the village went about their daily tasks around him, and he became a curiosity, especially to the children who would creep close to stare at him before running away giggling when he smiled at them. A young woman named Ayasha was assigned to bring him food and water. She was perhaps 20, with long braided hair and cautious eyes. At first, she would set down the food without speaking and leave quickly. But gradually, she began to linger, and eventually, to talk. "Why do you live alone?" she asked one evening. "You have no wife, no family." Jake shook his head. "I had a wife once. She died of fever 5 years ago. We never had children. Since then, it has just been me and the ranch." Ayasha looked surprised. You work the ranch alone? All of it. Most of it. I hire hands during roundup and branding season, but otherwise, yes. It is hard work, but it is mine. You must be very lonely, Ayasha said softly, and something in her voice made Jake look at her more closely. He saw understanding in her eyes, the recognition of someone who knew loneliness herself. As the days passed, other women began to approach Jake as well. An older woman named Kimmy brought him a blanket when the nights grew cold and stayed to tell him about her son who had been killed by soldiers. A middle-aged woman named Helona, who spoke excellent English, came to ask him questions about ranching and cattle. She explained that the women were trying to establish their own herds, but without men to help with the heavy work, it was difficult. Jake found himself offering advice, describing techniques for managing cattle, for finding water, for predicting weather. Helona listened intently, sometimes bringing other women to hear what he had to say. Gradually, the atmosphere around him shifted. He was still a prisoner, still tied to the post each night, but during the day, the women began to treat him less like a threat and more like a resource, someone whose knowledge might be valuable. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into his captivity, Nalin approached with several of the other women. They have been talking, she said without preamble. They say you have been helpful, that you answer questions honestly, that you do not look at our young women with disrespect, that you are kind to the children. Jake was not sure how to respond. I have no reason to be otherwise. You have treated me fairly. You could have killed me, but you did not. Nalin nodded slowly. We have a problem. We need help with heavy work. Building, moving large stones for water management, breaking horses. We have no men to do this work. Some of the women want to ask for your help. But I do not know if we can trust you. What would convince you? Jake asked. Nalin considered. If we untie you, will you try to escape? Jake thought about this carefully. If I gave you my word that I would not, would you believe me? I do not know, Nalin admitted. I have learned not to trust the word of white men. Then test me, Jake said. Untie me for 1 day. Let me help with whatever needs doing. If I try to escape, you can shoot me. You have enough weapons pointed at me that I would not get far. But if I keep my word, perhaps that will show you that not all white men are the same. Nalin discussed this with the other women in Apache, their voices rising and falling in debate. Finally, she turned back to Jake. We will try this. But know that if you betray our trust, it will not just be you who suffers. It will make things harder for any white person who claims to come in peace. I understand, Jake said solemnly. You have my word. They untied him, and Jake stood for the first time in 2 weeks, his legs shaky but holding. Several women watched him with arrows nocked and ready, but he made no sudden moves. Instead, he asked what needed to be done. They took him to where they were trying to build a water catchment system, a series of trenches and stone barriers designed to capture and hold rainwater. The work had stalled because moving the large stones required strength that even the strongest women struggled to provide. Jake examined the setup, suggested a few modifications based on what he had learned on his own ranch, and then set to work. He labored through the heat of the day, moving stones, digging trenches, constructing the barriers. The women worked alongside him, and he found himself impressed by their knowledge and skill. They knew this land intimately, understood how water flowed and where it would collect. They just needed help with the physical labor that their missing men would have provided. By evening, they had made more progress than the women had managed in a week. As the sun set, Jake returned to the post and held out his hands for the bonds. Nalin stared at him in surprise. You would let us tie you again? You could try to escape now, in the darkness. I gave you my word, Jake said simply. 1 day untied. That was the agreement. Something shifted in Nalin's expression. She nodded to the other women, and they tied him again, but loosely, more symbolic than restrictive. That night, Ayasha brought him extra food and sat with him while he ate. You kept your word, she said. This surprises many of us. Why? Jake asked. Is your experience with white men really so bad that keeping a promise is surprising? Ayasha looked away. Most white men who come to our lands see us as less than human. They make promises and break them. They take and give nothing back. You are different, We can see this now. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Each morning, Jake was untied and allowed to help with the heavy work around the village. He repaired dwellings, helped construct new ones, assisted with breaking horses, and shared his knowledge of ranching and land management. In return, the women taught him their language, showed him techniques for tracking and hunting that he had never learned, and gradually included him in the life of their community. Jake found himself growing close to many of the women, not romantically, but as friends and colleagues. He listened to Kimmy's stories of her lost family and shared his own grief over his wife. He taught Halona to read English from an old book she had traded for. He played simple games with the children who had lost their fathers and became a source of stability and kindness in their lives. But it was Ayasha who occupied his thoughts most often. She was intelligent and curious, asking him endless questions about the world beyond the canyon. She had a quick laugh and a gentle way with the children. And increasingly, Jake found himself watching for her approach, treasuring the time they spent talking in the evenings. 3 months into his captivity, which no longer felt like captivity at all, Nalin called a council. The entire village gathered, and Jake stood before them, no longer bound, as Nalin spoke. This man came to us as a trespasser. We took him prisoner. But he has proven himself to be honest and honorable. He has worked alongside us. He has shown respect to our ways. He has become part of our community. She paused, looking around at the gathered women. It is time to decide. Does he stay as a guest, free to come and go? Does he leave and return to his ranch? Or does he stay as one of us? There was a long discussion in Apache. Jake understood enough now to follow most of it. Some women argued he should be allowed to leave with their gratitude. Others suggested he stay but maintain his own separate life. But then Ayasha stood up, her voice clear and steady. I think he should stay as one of us. Not as a guest. As family. She paused, then added, if he wishes, I would take him as my husband. The gathered women erupted in whispers and exclamations. Jake felt his heart pounding. He looked at Ayasha, saw the hope and fear in her eyes, and realized that somewhere in these months of captivity, he had fallen in love with her, with this place, with these strong, resilient women who had built a community from the ashes of loss. Before he could speak, other women stood up. Halona said she would welcome him as a brother. Kimmy said he had already proven himself a good man and would make Ayasha a good husband. Even some of the women who had been most suspicious of him initially spoke in his favor. Finally, Nalin held up her hand for silence. She looked at Jake. You came here chasing thieves. You found something very different. We have all lost much. Our men, our lands, our old ways of life. But we have built something new here, something strong. If you choose to stay, you will be the only man in a village of strong women. Can you accept that? Can you honor that? Jake took a deep breath. I came here alone and angry, chasing something that did not matter. You captured me, and I thought my life was over. But instead, you showed me what I had been missing. All of you have taught me about courage and resilience. Ayasha has shown me that my heart is not as dead as I thought. If you will have me, I would be honored to stay. Not to lead or control, but to be part of this community you have built. The vote was not unanimous, but it was strong. Jake would stay. A week later, he and Ayasha were married in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with a few elements from Jake's own background. Halona stood beside them, translating vows that promised partnership and respect. Jake never returned to his ranch except to sell it and bring back supplies for the village. He became the only man in a community of women, but he never felt diminished by this. Instead, he felt honored. These women had survived losses that would have broken many men. They had built a community based on mutual support and respect. And somehow, they had found room in their hearts for a lonely rancher who had stumbled into their lives. Years later, when their children asked how he had come to live with them, Jake would smile and say he had been captured by the fiercest warriors he had ever met. They had tied him up, tested his character, and decided he was worth keeping. And he would add, looking at Ayasha, it was the luckiest day of my life. The village thrived. Jake's knowledge combined with the women's skills created a prosperous community. They became known in the region as a place where anyone could find fair trading and honest dealing. Other displaced Apache women sometimes joined them, and a few white women fleeing bad marriages or difficult circumstances also found refuge there. Jake had been captured as a prisoner, but he had won their hearts not through force or manipulation, but through simple decency, hard work, and genuine respect. He had shown them that not all men were the same, that honor and kindness could exist across any divide. And in return, they had given him something he had not even known he was missing. A family, a purpose, and a love that filled the lonely spaces in his heart. The lonely rancher who had set out alone chasing cattle thieves had found instead a community where he truly belonged, where his strength was valued but his gentleness was treasured even more. And every night, as he lay beside Ayasha listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep, he gave thanks for the day he had been captured by an Apache women's tribe and had his entire life transformed.